In part 2, I'll be taking you step by step of building a city block from start to finish. The hope is that once you grasp the techniques, you can then apply them to different scales of planning. The city block I picked has a flat terrain, focusing more on the fundamental stuff. If you want to learn more on how to create terrains, I cover some of it in part 3. First, depending on what your designated site location is, we'll have to geolocate. So we'll go under File, Geolocation, and Add Location. For location, I'm picking a city block project I worked on in Denver. And once it geolocates, you want to click on Select Region, and this frame allows you to crop a certain size that you want. I'm aiming at the specific block between East 16th and Colfax, and you want to keep it tight. Try not to include regions that isn't in your boundary, and I'll explain that in just a second. Once you're done framing it, we'll click on Export. Also, I prefer the large toolset on the side because it gives me more options. So I'm going to bring that up by right-clicking top bar and select Large Toolset. Okay, once the geolocation board is imported, you'll notice as you get closer that the pixelation is quite noticeable. And this is workable, but I'm going to introduce an extension called Placemaker. And the steps to install Placemaker is linked on the top right. If you want general knowledge on how to install extensions in SketchUp, I also linked a tutorial on the top right that explains it really well. Because we'll be installing more extensions on the way. In my case, I have the extension already, so I'm going to bring it up by right-clicking on the top bar, then choose Placemaker, and now the toolset appears. I'll click on the icon that says Placemaker dialog. This is where you can magically increase your workflow by importing buildings, roads, rivers, or trees straight from Placemaker. But before that, I'll demonstrate how you can significantly increase the clarity of the geolocated image. Also, I want to point out that this extension uses credits, so it does cost some when you import an element. When you buy credits, it prompts you to this page that asks for your license key. If you're using Pro version, you'll have a license key to punch in. But if you're using Studio version, you won't have a license key. So instead, I'll go to the official website of Placemaker, and under Shop Now, SketchUp Placemaker, I'll choose Pay As You Go. The $199 subscription is absolutely not needed. Once you accept the term, you are prompted to purchase 100 credits for $15, and in majority of cases, you can use 100 credits for multiple site models. And this is why I explained earlier to keep the boundary of your imported geolocation imagery tight, because the more you import, the more the credits. If you want to lower the pixelation, go to the second icon here that says Import Aerial Imagery. Also, for a heads up, importing a clear imagery will often use up a lot more credits than bringing in roads, for example. So if the pixelation doesn't bother you, I won't worry about it. So the map box gives you the satellite view, which costs significantly less than near map. The time when you would consider using Nearmap is when there have been sizable changes made to the community within the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm not sure what Hexagon does, never tried it before. In this case, we'll choose Mapbox. And it gives you a preview and shows how many credits it costs, and I'm going to hit Confirm. Now, as you can see, the pixelation has gone away with a much clearer imagery for you to trace on. To bring in the different elements from Placemaker, I'm going to start with the buildings. We'll select the aerial imagery, click on the building icon, then import buildings. This is when things start to get confusing because there are no building data in the area to be imported. That's because despite how efficient this extension can be, there are regions, especially residential areas, where it may lack data. If you were to work on, let's say, a city block of Larimer Square in downtown Denver, it's more of a commercial neighborhood and you're more likely to be able to import complete data. And in this case, everything you see other than the colors and the street labels were imported straight from Placemaker, including all the trees, which saves you a lot of time. For the street labels, I used 3D text to create them for your reference. In this case, since we aren't able to get any data of buildings within our block, I thought it would be a great opportunity to demonstrate some techniques for tracing building footprints and extruding them. With some of these, I'll simply apply the rectangular tool. The shortcut for that is R, and just click one corner point into the opposite side. With this one right beneath, I'll use the line tool to trace over it. The shortcut for that is L. As you're tracing, you'll notice the different colors when you're drawing orthogonally. Those are your axes. And the green dashed line implies that you reached the same extent horizontally as the line drawn beneath. So that's a way keeping your dimensions more accurately. In this scenario, the green dashes don't appear. So another way to ensure the line draws to the extent that you wish is by using arrow keys on your keyboard. The left arrow locks your movement on the green axis, the right arrow locks it on the red, and the up arrow key locks it on the blue axis, which is your z-axis that generates three-dimensional components. So, to line this facade width to the one on the right, I can hit my left arrow key, which locks it on the green axis, then hover my cursor to this endpoint and click on it. As you enclose the lines, it automatically creates a surface for you. Also, if you don't like a certain segment you drew, you can use the eraser tool. Shortcut is E. You can also use selection instead of the eraser, and it works similarly to AutoCAD. If you drag it from the left to the right, it selects only the elements that are completely drenched. If you drag them from right to left, the line segments and surfaces that are partially included will also be completely selected. In some scenarios, this might be a quicker way than the eraser tool. Next, I'm going to trace the rest of the buildings, and I'll skip this process and jump right into extruding the buildings. To extrude the buildings, we need to know the estimated heights for them. For that, I'm going to pull up Google Earth. To measure building heights, make sure to turn on 3D buildings. Is that snow? Interesting. I wonder why it's snowing on Google Earth in late May here in Boulder. In this case, as you can see, only a couple buildings actually transformed three-dimensionally, and none are within the city block. Since there are no three-dimensional buildings here, we're going to turn on terrain. Oftentimes you'd have to zoom out and adjust, and in this case it went way off. So give me a second here. Okay, you'll notice that now every building has a height, including the ground elevation. If you don't see the status bar, you can find it under View, Status Bar. The elevation is what we need. And I'll pick this AutoZone property, for example. The ground elevation is 5299, about 5,300 feet. And the elevation for the roof of the building is 5316, indicating that the building itself is about 16 feet tall. So we'll go back to SketchUp and find the push-pull tool. Shortcut for that is P. Click on it and type in 16 feet. And the lower right bar displays the distance of height. Let's suppose that this building has the same height. Another way besides typing it is to hold down your push-pull tool and hover it over the roof of AutoZone, and that will help create an identical height. In this tutorial, I'm just demonstrating it all as flat roofs because creating these other gable and hip roofs get more into architecture modeling, and in planning projects we don't necessarily need all that detail. And again, I'm going to skip the process of extruding the rest of the building footprints. There's a way to simultaneously extrude multiple surfaces by using an extension called Joint Push-Pull, which is covered in part 3. And I'm not demonstrating it here because we are working on a larger scale with fewer buildings. Once the buildings are all extruded, the next element we are bringing in are the roads. Again, we'll select the board, then import the roads, confirm. The imported elements, the roads in this case, can also be tagged on and off. If you want to hide the aerial imagery, you can do that by turning off the location snapshot layer. Another way to hide objects is by right-clicking it and select Hide. And to unhide, go under View, Show Hidden Object, then right-click on it and select Unhide. For now, we'll turn the location snapshot layer off. The issue with directly imported roads from Placemaker is that you can't alter it. For example, let's say I want to curve the edges. I can't connect my endpoints to the road. The technique of making them editable is to explode them all and make sure they are completely exploded. And by knowing whether they are completely exploded is when you see all the dotted blue lines. If you see blue lines in rectangles, that means they are still grouped. After exploding them, unhide everything, and now you can see the edge lines, which indicates that they are editable. Now, if you try to create a rounded edge using Arc Tool, shortcut A on your keyboard, you're able to make changes to it. I'm hoping to lighten the dark gray of the roads a bit. So I'll hit B on my keyboard to access the materials tray and hold down Alt on a PC or Command on a Mac to access the eyedropper. And under Edit, I can adjust and lighten the gray. Another issue we have here, I'm going to switch the view to front and parallel projection. It's hard to see, but if I zoom in closer, you'll notice that the roads are slightly above the buildings. And to avoid potential problems, it's always better to ensure that all elements stay on the same ground plane. To address that, I'm going to select all the road elements by triple-clicking it, and pick your Move tool, M on your keyboard, and hit the top arrow key on your keyboard to lock the direction along the blue axis, and hover it to the bottom plane of the building. As you can see, the slight adjustment it made, but it's very important because if they aren't on the same plane, you could have trouble forming ground pattern surfaces later on, and it could be a total hassle fixing it. Lastly, make sure the roads are retacked to the untacked layer. I explain why in part 3 under merged with existing geometry. The only components you want tagged separately are models you bring in from the 3D warehouse that has file size, where you can toggle them on and off to speed up your workflow. And next step is to import the paths. For importing the footpaths, unfortunately for this region, there isn't data available, so we'd have to trace the paths by hand. What's good is that we have a clear imagery to trace over. If you compare this to the original one, you'll see how difficult it was to trace over the pixelated one. I'm going to set this back to top view. And actually, before the paths, I'd recommend tracing the larger components, such as green and asphalt faces. But we do face a problem here. If we try to trace along the edges of the building, when I alter the view, you'll notice that the lines are floating in the air at different directions. And that happened because as we go back to the top view, the lines we connected to the buildings were the rooftops, not the ground surface. A way to avoid this is to set the view to front with parallel projection. I'm going to drag from right to left to select anything above ground level and hide them. Now when you start tracing, you can still see the building footprints and ensure that the lines you trace are all on the same surface. I'll go ahead and trace this large parking lot for demonstration. Once the lines are all closed, it should automatically generate a surface for you. And I usually change the color to a transparent or translucent glass material. So that you can see through, and if you want to see through even more, you can adjust the opacity right here. Now I can go ahead and trace the secondary components. Also, to point out, if you don't want to be tracing and seeing all this overlay effect from between the aerial imagery and your surface, just select the imagery and your move tool, hit the top arrow key to lock the z-axis, and I'm just going to type in 10 feet. It could even be 1 inch, as long as they are not on the same plane. But what's very important is that you create all the ground surfaces, because if I try to draw a rectangle straight on the aerial imagery, you'll notice that it used the imagery as reference plane. To create surface, you can use your line tool and simply draw it over a segment so that SketchUp understands that you're trying to create a surface. Then apply the glass material. I'll go ahead and finish up all the tracing work. For the trees, there's no available data for this region in Placemaker, so we'll have to import the trees from the 3D warehouse. Be aware of the model size you're importing, because large model sizes can slow down your computer. When that happens, the technique for speeding your workflow up is to hide the layers of the trees when you don't need them on. If your team decides to use SketchUp as your top view master plan, I wouldn't choose the 2D trees because they will end up being lines when you set it to top view. For 3D perspective views, 2D trees work just fine and generate shadows pretty accurately. Also, some groups might prefer not to use trees from SketchUp and prefer adding them in Photoshop due to texture preferences, which is totally doable. I would say that a big advantage for adding the trees straight from SketchUp is that all the proportions, most of the proportions will be accurate, and so will all the shadow patterns. In 3D Warehouse for trees, I usually browse through models, collections, or catalogs. What's good about catalogs is that if you find a tree type that you like, you can get a list of many others with similar style, which is pretty nice. That can work really well when you're trying to create a variation of trees with a coherent style. I'll pick this tree for demonstration. It's 480 kilobytes, which is fairly low. If you like this tree type and you want to save it for future use of other projects, you can like it, add to favorites. You can also click on the folder icon and create a folder name. And in this case, I already created the tree folder, so I'll just add it to the tree folder. When you want access to it, just go to My Content, and I saved it under folder, so if you click folder and go under Model, you'll be able to locate the tree you saved. So I'm going to import the tree. It looks super dark now because the lines are on, and we can turn the edges and lines off under Styles. Depending on whether you want the lines in your final model or not, if not, make sure to turn the lines off and see how the tree looks. Sometimes they look nice with the lines, but not when you turn them off. And vice versa, if you're considering a site model with the lines on, this tree type gets pretty congested with the dark lines, so it's probably not the ideal tree type. I strongly recommend that the first thing to do when you import a tree is to tag them under trees. I'm going to create a layer called trees. If you see PM trees, don't tag under that, and I'll explain why later on. Eventually, all the PM layers will be deleted. Now that it's tagged, you can copy as many trees as you want, and they will all be under the same layer, which makes it much easier when you want to tag them off to create more efficient workflow. If you want to resize the trees, simply apply the Scale tool. Shortcut for that is S. Then use the Move tool to situate it to the proper location from the imagery, and make sure to move the tree from the bottom of the trunk. I'll go ahead and finish up the rest of the trees. Okay, the trees are all imported. I only used one type of tree all the way across the block because it's merely a demonstration, but do make sure in your projects to have at least a couple or more tree types to create a sense of biodiversity. Now we're in the stage of applying colors. In part 3, I cover how you can pick the exact colors you want from Adobe Illustrator color theme. For this model, I'll be applying colors straight from default colors in SketchUp. To prevent potential lag, I'm going to turn off the trees. Also, I'll turn off the location snapshot to keep it visually simple, but I'll keep the shadows on because as covered in part 1, colors look slightly different when the shadows are turned on. I'm going to pick a random green here. Most of the default colors from SketchUp are quite saturated. If you want a more desaturated touch, one way is to use the Edit panel and bring that little rectangular point closer to the center of the color wheel. Let's say I want to change the color of the streets. I can use the eyedropper tool to select the color, then go under Edit, and I'm going to lighten the gray a little bit. Just to recap from part 1, if you want to change the colors of the buildings all at once, since they are all under the default color now, make sure nothing is selected by holding down Ctrl-T on PC or Shift-Command-A on Mac. I'll pick a dark purple here, and I'll hold down my Shift key while applying the color to the building surface. I'll go ahead and finish up the coloring process, and our next step will be to set scenes and export the images. When you create certain views for your projects, such as a base for rendering, before doing so, make sure that the layers under tags that has PM up front are all deleted. When PM layers are present, when you try to add or update scenes, it either doesn't create or update, or it lags and shuts down SketchUp. At least my computer tends to do that. These PM layers came with the geolocated imagery, and it's unnecessary to have them in our project modeling. Essentially, other than PM imagery, all other ones with PM up front have nothing in them. If there's anything in it, like PM imagery, it will ask you which layer you want them assigned instead. And I will keep the PM imagery, but I'll delete all others. Eventually, besides untagged and the imagery, all you need layer-wise are trees or anything imported from 3D Warehouse, such as cars, as well as the location snapshot. You can keep the location terrain if you prefer. Since the site is pretty flat, I won't worry about building models along the terrain. After the layers are cleaned up, it's time to create scenes. We'll delete all these other scenes that were generated when we imported the imagery. To prevent lag, another technique is to turn off both the trees and the shadow, especially before you create the scene, because oftentimes it doesn't like to generate a scene when the shadows or the trees are on. The scene is really just to create a perspective view that you can refer back to. You can always turn the lines off and toggle the shadows and trees back on when you are going to export the view as an image. If you want another view, you can simply add another, or if you want to change the original view, you can go ahead and update it. Just a quick point out, earlier the lines were turned back on when I clicked the scene. One way to address that is to update style with changes. You can also add, update, or remove scenes at the top bar. The techniques for animation covered in part 4 also is applied using the scene tray. When you're ready to export the view, make sure to export it as 2D graphic. Usually with 3D perspective views, I go with JPEG or PNG format, and then make further renderings edits in Photoshop. If you create a site plan and you want to be able to edit the lines in Illustrator, for example, both PDF or EPS will allow you to accomplish that. For how to create Photoshop realistic renderings, one of my group partners made a tutorial series during our project, which provides a step-by-step process, and the tutorial is linked on the top right. If you like the style of keeping the lined contours when you export, but you want the shadows to be included, this other link on the top right gives a really good detail from instructor Danielle Rivera, where she explains the process of doing so from a SketchUp model all the way to the final editing portion in Photoshop. This tutorial provides you the tools and techniques to create a basic city block model. In part 3, I explain various types of scenarios where issues might appear and how to address them. I also cover other circumstances such as creating terrains, setting random heights of residential buildings in a small scale, applying color theme from Illustrator to SketchUp, Rhino models to SketchUp, and many others. So stay tuned in.